This video essay is an analysis of film adaptations that were directed either whole or in part by the author of the original work. Much has been written about the wider umbrella of the adaptation, however I will argue that there is a lot left uncovered about this particular niche. For a concept so specific, there is a surprisingly large amount of artistic works that this definition applies to. This essay will discuss three main examples: Sin City, Hedwig and the Angry Inch, and Akira. As this is a relatively undiscussed topic, I will propose a new term for these type of adaptations, called the Authorial adaptation. An example of an early authorial adaptation is The Homesteader, a lost black and white film from 1919, directed and based on a novel by Oscar Micheaux. This example, along with others such as The Story of a Cheat, demonstrates that there is a long history of the authorial adaptation, with much room for examination and analysis. In his journal article, Literature and Film Adaptation Theories, Methodological Approaches, Alex Pinar discusses multiple approaches in analysing an adaptation in relation to its original source material. This includes the fidelity approach, which is based on the assumption that a literary work has only one possible interpretation which a director must fill, the taxonomy/categorization approach, which categorizes films based on how closely they resemble the source material, and other more recent approaches. When it comes to the authorial adaptation, one would reasonably assume that the fidelity approach could be applied, as the director of the adaptation must surely be fulfilling the one possible interpretation of the original work. This is a key assumption that I will be examining and challenging. Frank Miller created the Sin City crime graphic novel series in 1991, which ran for 9 years. The series as a whole is a collection of shorter stories that all take place within the same city with the same stylish presentation and tone. Director Robert Rodriguez asked him to be heavily involved in the film adaptation as co-director. Miller was hesitant as he didn't have experience in the director role, but agreed, stating, "I had no idea what it was like to actually be a director and make those decisions on set, but on the first day I decided that I was in for the whole ride." The film itself is a collection of short stories, some being presented in their whole, some being split into multiple parts with other stories being shown between them. Miller's influence in the film's visual style is immediately apparent. Almost all of the dialogue and cinematography is translated directly from the graphic novel.
Damn it, Hardigan. I won't let you do this. You're gonna get yourself killed. You're gonna get us both killed. I won't let you, I'm warning you. I got my coat, Bob.
Many features of cinema, such as sound, editing, and motion, cannot be utilised in the format of a graphic novel, therefore it can be described as a non-cinematic visual art form. This method of recreating a non-cinematic visual art form is what Hogan refers to as painterly cinema. An example of this occurs within the opening scene of Sin City. During this scene, one of the shots directly recreates one of the panels with a minimalist black and white presentation. The composition of the shot is almost identical to the panel, albeit with some added depth, and the dialogue is the same as well.
The wind rises electric. She's soft and warm and almost weightless.
This recreation of the inherently non-cinematic graphic novel means that Sin City has foregrounded visual style to accentuate the thematic and emotional aspects of the story. Sin City heavily commits to Frank Miller's original source material and creates a unique cinematic experience as a result. Drawing on the methodological approaches mentioned earlier, Sin City could arguably fall under the fidelity approach, that being that there is only one possible interpretation to the story which the director must fulfill. However, there are some examples of changes to the narrative, such as in the finale of the Hard Goodbye short being heavily edited in comparison to the chapter. What changes do exist are minor, but are done to serve the narrative structure of a 2-hour film as opposed to smaller chapters in a large graphic novel series. As a result, Sin City is better described as falling under the taxonomy/categorization approach. This approach categorizes adaptations as either transposition, where the work is adapted with minimal interference, commentary, where there is strong alteration and the adaptation is created with an overtly different intention, and analogy, where the original work is considered a point of departure to create an entirely new text. I argue that Sin City is an example of transposition, as the authorial influence to the film has retained almost all of the graphic novel's style and narrative, whilst making changes to better fit the film medium. Incidentally, the film is not credited with a screenwriter, with the credits only saying, based on the Sin City graphic novel by Frank Miller, embracing the concept of the authorial adaptation. Hedwig and the Angry Inch is a stage musical created in the late 90s by John Cameron Mitchell and Stephen Trask, and tells the story of a genderqueer punk rock star named Hedwig, as they describe their trials and tribulations through life, from growing up in Cold War Berlin to performing in America. Whilst Trask handled the music and lyrics, Mitchell wrote the story and starred in the lead role. The musical was then adapted into film in 2001, which Mitchell also wrote, directed and starred in. Trask also features as a supporting character in both the stage production and the film. Having these two creators so integral to both versions of the story makes it a prime example of an authorial adaptation. The film closely follows the narrative of the stage musical, with the screenplay being mostly identical.
How did some slip of a girly boy from communist East Berlin become the internationally ignored song stylist barely standing before you? How did some slip of a girly boy from communist East Berlin become the internationally ignored song stylist barely standing before you?
However, due to the nature of the original work being performed live, many details and idiosyncrasies will arrive from either improvisation or a conscious evolution of the script, whereas the film adaptation will be set in stone. This dynamic means that the script written for the film several years into the stage production will differ slightly from the original stage screenplay and may take on changes that developed over the production run of the performance. The film being developed with the hindsight of several years of performance can demonstrate that the interpretation of the author themselves can change over time and not reflect the original work 100% accurately. This challenges the fidelity approach, as this literary work can have multiple interpretations from even the original authors revisiting it years later.
It's funny because we were always the dirty underdog when we first came out, and the theater community was sort of afraid of us. The non-theater community rushed in and loved it. But the regular folks there'd be many shows where there'd be silence, and confused silence, which is where I was imagining the film, because I imagine the film was more Hedwig in weird restaurants and things where people aren't sure why she's there.
I propose that this example of the restaurant audience in the film reacting to Hedwig in the way they do is a response or reaction from Mitchell drawing on the life event of producing the stage musical and using that in the later adaptation. This moment also demonstrates how changes will arise from the format of film language. The stage production features audience interaction and the protagonist Hedwig directly addressing them, whereas the film translates this three separate ways. Hedwig sometimes acts as a voice of God narrator.
In the year I was born, the wall went up. And many people decided to move west to freedom.
Sometimes speaks directly to the camera and breaks the fourth wall.
And then there were the crypto, homo, rockers, Lou Reed, Iggy Pop, David Bowie, who was actually an idiom, working in America and Canada.
And sometimes literally speaks to a diegetic audience within a scene. An example of audience interaction being translated from the musical to the film comes during the final song sequence. At the end of the narrative, the character of Yitzhak completes their arc by wearing a wig and ceremoniously embracing who they are by walking down the aisle and standing in front of the audience, who then cheer and applaud. This audience interaction is used by Mitchell in the film by having Yitzhak be applauded by an audience and then stage diving.
Ballerina, dancing to your rock and roll. There's the Patty, and Gina, and Yoko, Aretha.
These examples demonstrate that being an authorial adaptation of a musical, Hedwig and the Angry Inch evolved as a text throughout its stage production based on the unique experience of the original authors, and that evolution is seen in the film. Akira is a post-apocalyptic cyberpunk manga series published in Weekly Young magazine from 1982 to 1990. It ran for 120 chapters that have been compiled into 6 large volumes, and also received an anime adaptation in the form of the 1988 film of the same name. The film was directed by the author of the manga, known as a mangaka, Katsuhiro Ōtomo, and is widely considered to be one of the key pieces of media that introduced the United States to anime. The story follows several young adults in bike gangs amidst the setting of Neo-Tokyo, several decades after World War III. These characters are thrown into a conflict between one another and the government as some start to awaken psychic powers. Akira is an interesting case study of an authorial adaptation being created during the original run of the original source material, and as such raises questions about what exactly is being adapted from what. Drawing from what was said about Hedwig, I will further argue that the film and the original work interact with each other, with the hindsight gained from being directed by the author. Ōtomo has stated that he didn't intend to adapt Akira into a film whilst writing it, but then agreed when it was suggested to him.
まずアニメーションを作らないかっていうふうに言われたんでね、最初は要するに別にこれを映像化しようというふうにして考えて作ってたわけじゃないんで、アニメーションしないかっていう時にアニメーション僕が好きでしたから、じゃあそのその辺でアニメーションじゃあやってみようかな。
Within this interview, he details the advantages of producing the story in an animated form as opposed to the motionless panels of the manga.
まずどこを動かすかというとやっぱりその喋ってる口を動かす、要するにアニメーションのその驚きって言いますかね、それは、絵が動くというやっぱりその驚き基本的なものがそういうもんだと思うので、そういうふうにとにかく動かしてみたいという。
Anime adaptations are often very faithful to their manga counterparts, as they are both text that are drawn, and as a result, panels can be replicated. One could also argue that this is an example of painterly cinema. The manga of Akira is roughly 2,000 pages long, and the film only adapts a small part of the large saga as a result. Being developed after the beginning of the manga but before the end, we can see how they influence one another. The opening of the story is similar in both, however more time is spent on developing the city of Neo-Tokyo in the anime. We see many shots of the wider cityscape and smaller corners that are absent in the first chapters of the manga. However, the conclusion of the manga showcases far more of the mass destruction within the plot. I suggest that the increase of showing Neo-Tokyo in the anime and the latter half of the manga demonstrates how Ōtomo's vision of Akira changed over time working on the project, a result of being an authorial adaptation. Drawing on this, when applied to the methodological approaches, I would argue that Akira falls under the categorization of analogy. The film in itself is a wholly different work from the manga, and potentially even seen as a new text in itself. Many images and story beats are the same, however the focus of the story is on a much smaller scale than the sprawling saga of the manga. This new work also influenced the end of the manga, as, being a singular text, it had to conclude before the manga had reached its own finale. Like the rest of the story, the climax is similar in many places, yet in a completely different context. This is an example of an authorial adaptation where the original mangaka created a very different text to the original work, challenging the idea that an author will replicate their original vision entirely accurately. The long history of film adaptations being directed by their original authors demonstrate that this specific niche has plenty of room for exploration. As demonstrated using the 3 case studies I've analysed, there is a wide variety of approaches the director of an authorial adaptation can take, whether replicating the source material almost one-to-one, being influenced in their creative decisions over time, and even developing a very different work in itself. The relationship between original text and film adaptation isn't set in stone, and even an authorial adaptation in itself can offer a diverse range of interesting ideas and concepts that can be discovered.